Welcome back to another episode of Written for Our Admonition. We're continuing in the series we started just 2 short weeks ago about the Old Testament, aiming to improve our literacy in the Old Testament and understand the lessons that broadly help us to understand the New Testament as well. Since, as we discussed in our first episode 2 weeks ago, we realized that they're intertwined. You cannot really have the new if you don't have the old, so we want to understand what the old established and how the new then builds upon that foundation. But specifically for this discussion today, we're focusing in on sin, grace, and the Great Flood, which is a build-up from what we talked about last week, which was the creation of the world and all the different events that attended the creation. And just to briefly review that from Genesis chapter 1, we saw that everything that was made, we saw that the animals upon the earth, humanity, both man and woman, the physical world on which we live, plant life, everything that we could possibly imagine in creation, God ushered in. He spoke it, and it happened. His great power was exercised in the creation, and all came to pass as he willed. But all was not going to remain that way. All that God made was not going to remain good. It would be corrupted because of sin, which is going to be the focus of our conversation in just a few short moments. Before we go any further, I did just want to mention briefly that I am using a new microphone, so hopefully the quality is better. I usually would use my headset along with the headset microphone, but I thought if we're going to continue doing this, maybe I should get a bit of an upgrade. So hopefully this is better. Hopefully it is an improvement. I am looking for your feedback if you notice anything weird about how it sounds, or if maybe it's too quiet or too loud, or there's some weird noises or whatever going on. Just let me know about that, and we'll make sure we get that corrected. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead and dive into our discussion. So we have to understand from the Genesis account that in the Garden of Eden, which is where Adam and Eve were living by God's command and by his ordination, that God had provided everything that they needed, but it simply was not enough for them. We know that God provided all that was needed because a text like Genesis chapter 2 and verse 9 directly says, he gave them all the trees that were pleasant to look upon and that were good for food. So they were not lacking in any respect. They had all that they needed, and anything they needed beyond that, God would provide it in abundance. And all that God expected of them really was to tend to the garden, to take care of it as he willed for them to do. And then on top of that, he had one other commandment that they had to follow. Do not partake of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He said that directly in Genesis chapter 2, verses 16 through 17. And yet that was the one tree that they simply could not resist. The curiosity got to them. But more than that, we're going to find other influences infiltrated their minds and led them down a path from which they could not recover, and a path that would still impact us even to this day, however many thousands of years later it has been. So we want to consider all that took place surrounding this and understand how sin entered the world, but then understand why this was such a horrible circumstance, to really grasp the depths of why sin is so horrible. And I believe Genesis chapter 3 in particular really establishes that well for us. It helps us to really understand and come to grips with why sin is so terrible in God's sight, and why it is something he despises, but also why it is something that has a great impact on us and our relationship with him, but even the creation itself. So without further ado, let's go ahead and read the text of Genesis chapter 3. We're going to look at the first 7 verses here, and I'm focusing specifically on the serpent in this particular case because we're going to see how he's able to win Eve over in this situation, but then also focus on how Eve and Adam both were led astray in this circumstance. So would you join me please in the reading of Genesis chapter 3 and verses 1 through 7. Now the serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, Has God indeed said, You shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, We may eat the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, You shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die. Then the serpent said to the woman, You will not surely die. For God knows in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave to her husband with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves coverings. So notice what's taking place in this text. Notice how the serpent approaches Eve, and notice how she ends up being deceived by what the serpent has to say. So we go back to verse 1. The serpent approaches Eve in a moment of vulnerability, apparently, and he has this question. Has God indeed said, You shall not eat of every tree of the garden? So the serpent already is establishing that what God said may or may not actually be true. He's already questioning what God has put forth to Adam and Eve and making them think that maybe, just maybe, his command is not absolute, or perhaps that there is a reason and a motive behind it that is not so pure and holy. So God, or Eve rather, in verses 2 through 3, tells the serpent what God had said concerning that tree, that they were not to partake of it. And the serpent, after he hears this, retorts to Eve, "You will not surely die. You are not going to perish if you partake of that fruit. It's not going to kill you to do that." And the reason that God commanded it in verse 5, as the serpent goes through this, is that he's afraid of you. He's afraid that you are going to be like him, that you're going to be on his level, that you might contest him in some respect, that you might be able to overthrow him in some respect. Now, obviously, we look back on that and think, how ridiculous. But in that moment, with the naivete of Eve and Adam for that matter, with the level of innocence they would have had at this time without sin being in the world, and them having no real understanding of what that would mean until after this event, we might have an understanding of how this would have been a bit more alluring to them than it might be to us, who live in a very different situation than they did. But nevertheless, verse 6, notice how this unfolds. So all the serpent does is calls God's word into question. He makes Eve doubt that what God said was absolute. He makes her think that maybe this really isn't such a big deal. And maybe the reason that God told us not to do that is because he's a bit afraid of us, and, well, that doesn't abide with me. But verse 6 actually gets to the heart of the issue. The woman saw the tree was good for food, it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise. So she begins looking at that tree very differently now. At first, in verses 2 through 3, she was clear that what God's command said was to avoid it. She understood that well, and she was obedient to that. But now, verse 6, after the serpent has tempted her and misled her in this direction, now she's thinking very differently about it, and she looks at it through a different lens, and she says, actually, no, I think we can actually do this without repercussion. After all, the serpent said we're not going to die, but it's that very thing that is actually going to usher in death. But death perhaps in a sense that they would not have really been able to anticipate. Now, the issue here is not that God had failed them. It is not an issue that God had set them up to fail either. It's an issue of the fact that they made a choice here. And I'm saying they, even though Eve is in view in this passage, because notice at the end of verse 6 what takes place. Adam also partakes along with his wife. That should never have happened. Of all the things that should have taken place here, it should have been that Adam said, enough is enough, the serpent is lying to us, he needs to get out of here, we need to go see what God would say about this matter. That's what should have happened, but that's not what happened. So Adam and Eve are going to share the blame for this, although later on in the New Testament specifically, we'll find that Eve is given a more sense of the blame for this, but those contexts have their own unique situations that are unfolding there. But let's be very clear that it's Adam and Eve both that receive a blame for this. We're going to find in other places that Adam is given the lion's share of the blame, that he is viewed as the transgressor. So it all depends on the context in which you're dealing, but this will become a reference point for sin entering the world. It'll become very clear that it was through both of them, because of their choice to disobey God, that this all unfolded the way that it did. And let's be clear about something else concerning the sin they committed here. The sin fundamentally was one of disobedience. The fact of the matter is, they went against God's commandment. They did the opposite of what he said to do, and that is where the sin entered the world. That is how it was ushered in, was through not doing what God said and falling for the temptation of Satan. So verse 7, the result is unfortunate. The eyes of both of them were opened, not because God allowed that to happen, but simply because they disobeyed him and took a direction and a route that he did not authorize. They knew they were naked. They made themselves coverings. All of a sudden, the innocence that they had and the bliss they enjoyed by God's command has now fizzled out. It is no longer there because sin has taken that away from them. So the repercussions of sin are going to be quite swift. It's not going to be a pretty sight what's going to unfold next. Let's go back to our slideshow here, and let's look at the next sequence of this and understand just how horrible this sin is and why it is such a problem of what the curses that result from it. So as we talk about the sin that was committed here and what unfolds as a result of that sin, we see just how fundamentally creation has now changed. We see that now the relationship that Adam and Eve have with God has fundamentally changed. He was walking with them in the Garden of Eden. He was there with them in a sense that it's hard for us maybe to understand even. But he was there in their presence, enjoying that fellowship with them. They had a direct connection to him because they were perfect. They had that connection that was so beautiful and so wonderful, but because of sin, it was now hindered. But that's not all that takes place. Let's go back to our text now. We're still in Genesis chapter 3. And here I'm just going to scroll down just a little bit here, and we're going to go ahead and look at verses 14 on down to about verse 19, just to talk about these curses very briefly. So I'm beginning in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 14, reading on down to verse 19. So the Lord God said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, you are cursed more than all cattle, and more than every beast of the field. On your belly you shall go, and you shall eat dust all the days of your life. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. To the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Then to Adam he said, Because you have heeded the voice of your wife, and have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, saying, You shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return." So we see what sin has now brought forth to mankind, and none of it is good. None of it is what it should have been. And yet it was because of the sin that Adam and Eve committed that brought this forth. Just consider these curses. Think about the curse that is brought upon Eve. The fact that she's going to have painful childbirth. The fact that her relationship with her husband has now been drastically altered. It has been harmed because of what she has done. But not only is she cursed, but even Adam is cursed. And not only is Adam cursed, but the ground itself is cursed. God says that because of what you have done, now the earth is going to be contaminated. It's going to be harmed because of what you have done. Creation itself has been altered because of what sin has brought forth. Now, we don't want to make sin the scapegoat for every single bad thing that happens, but in a sense, there is the fact that sin has been responsible for a lot of these problems. That the fact that creation is the way that it is now, the way we understand it, where these devastating storms unfold, where we see these horrible tragedies and disasters unfold before us, in many respects, sin is responsible for that. Because sin not only affected Adam and Eve as individuals and the soul that they have, it even affected creation itself. And that's precisely why creation is yearning for redemption, looking forward to the day that it's released from the torment that's been placed upon it because of sin. And all that was ushered in because of disobedience to God's command. And that's not all that's going to take place. Going down a little bit further, verses 22 through 24, rather, here in Genesis chapter 3, we see here what takes place. They were in the Garden of Eden, a place of paradise, a place where everything they needed was provided for them. Now they are thrust out. That was the final nail in the coffin, as it were, to their relationship with God being what it was before. No more would they enjoy that fellowship with Him the way they had in the garden. It was going to be fundamentally different now because of what they chose in sin. So all these thousands of years later, you and I are still dealing with the consequences of sin. We are still dealing with what Adam and Eve introduced to the world. These curses are still, in many respects, in effect. Now, these curses have been eased in some respects, you might say, and we could have a discussion and a debate about all that, but regardless, we still see these curses affecting the world in which we live. It still affects our relationship to God. We still struggle with sin. We still have all these issues that have come because of the choice that Adam and Eve made all those thousands of years ago to do what they did. And so that establishes right off the bat within Scripture the fundamental problem that we're going to face as human beings, both man and woman. We're going to be dealing with sin. We're going to be dealing with its curses. And we have to work within that framework to reach God, to come to Him and to serve Him effectively, but also on His part to make available to us the means for us to escape these situations, to escape from the snare of sin and its consequences, to become what God would have us to be. That'll be the fundamental challenge that begins in Genesis 3, but is going to continue throughout the entirety of Scripture, is escaping from sin, doing the will of God, not following in the same example of disobedience, but rather following the example that God would set before us to be obedient. So sin has many consequences. It has many curses, and sadly, it does not end there. But, at the same time, that as sin afflicts creation, we find that God's graciousness is able to overwhelm that. We're going to find in another place, Genesis chapter 6 specifically, that things are going to get worse before they get better. But there is going to be a bright spot in the midst of all of this. We're going to talk about Noah in just a moment, who is that bright spot. But I want us to look at this text in Genesis chapter 6. And I want us to think more about why graciousness is so important here, even as far back as the book of Genesis. Typically, when grace is talked about and God's graciousness being shown to people, we don't always associate that with what happens here in the flood account of Genesis. And yet it's actually in this account that we really see his grace being showcased for us in a profound way that maybe reveals to us that God's graciousness has been understood for a lot longer than maybe we really realized. So let's go ahead and look at Genesis chapter 6 here together. I'm looking specifically at verses 1 through 5. Now it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants on the earth in those days, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So sin has now gone to seed, we might say. It has now become pervasive. It is all over the face of the earth. And verses 6 through 7 then, the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. So now sin has reached a boiling point. There must be something done about the sin that's taking place on the earth. Verse 5 summarizes it better than I possibly could. The wickedness of man was so great on the earth that every thought that man had was only evil continually. Can you imagine that? We talk about how bad our times can be, but can you really imagine a time like Genesis chapter 6 and verse 5 where every person on the face of the earth, as a general rule, only thinks about evil deeds? It's been bad in our time. It's been bad before our time, but it will never possibly be as bad as it was in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 5. And again, we could probably debate that back and forth, but I think we understand that that is a horrible description of the state of affairs for humanity at this point in time. It's no wonder verses 6 through 7 says that God was sorry he had made man on the earth, that he was grieved by what man had chosen. It was not his will for this to take place, and yet this is what man was generally choosing over God and over his service. And so God says, I will destroy them. I have to get rid of this. I have to purify the earth. I have to cleanse the sins that have been committed, and I have to get rid of all these people who have committed those sins. And even those who are innocent, these animals who are caught up in the mix, they have to be wiped clean from this as well. So again, it's no wonder the flood has to come. It's no wonder the whole world has to be overthrown in this respect to reset things. But in the midst of all of this, as I mentioned just a moment ago, God's graciousness will shine through. Notice verse 8 of Genesis chapter 6 on the screen. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Now we find the name Noah refers to rest. He was named that way back in Genesis chapter 5 because his father said that he will provide rest and comfort amid the curses that have fallen upon us because of sin. I'm summarizing basically what he said there, but that's the idea. So in the midst of a corrupt generation, though, Noah will stand out as a rare bright spot. And he is going to be the one through whom God will deliver humanity from the coming destruction of the great flood. He's going to be the one that God will choose to establish his covenant with. A covenant, by the way, that will in many respects continue into our own day today, which we'll see in just a moment. So all of humanity will survive the flood that's coming. It will not be many people who survive, to be sure, but Noah and his family will be the ones to weather that storm. They will be the ones to see the other side of it. They will be the ones to reset things to be back on track with where God would have them to be. So going back to our slideshow for just a brief moment, make sure I can get to the right slide here. There we go. But we see here, once again, going back to the idea of Noah and his family escaping the waters of the flood, we see that Noah did exactly what God commanded. God said to build an ark, and that's what Noah did. God gave him the dimensions of the ark. Noah followed them to a T. God said to bring forth the animals into the ark. That's exactly what happened because Noah was obedient to what God said. Genesis would tell us directly that Noah did everything God asked him to do and that he walked with God, that he was in some respects a man who was intent on doing his will. And that is how he, along with his family and the animals who are in the ark, are going to survive. But let's really focus on an idea that's going to come up quite often in the Old Testament, and it really starts here in this account with Noah and the escape from the flood. I'm going to go back to Genesis chapter 6 for just a moment here. And we're going to go down to verse 18 specifically. And I want you to notice a significant word that comes up here. I will establish my covenant with you. He's speaking there to Noah. That is the Lord speaking to Noah. And he's saying there, I will establish my covenant with you. In other words, I'm going to give you a promise. I'm going to give you a command. You're going to obey my commandment to receive that promise. And I will make sure that you are blessed and that you have everything that you need in order to survive this. So the idea of the covenant is introduced here to show to us that God established that with Noah first, to establish the fact that this is a relationship that he wanted with Noah. He wanted this to be a situation that unfolded properly. He wanted Noah to be blessed and for his family to survive and for humanity to continue because of the type of character that Noah possessed. He was a man who followed after God, who walked in his ways, who did his will, and we see that demonstrated for us quite clearly throughout the Genesis account in chapters 6 through 8 specifically. But it's not only that covenant we're going to find, but also another covenant. That's going to be in Genesis chapter 9. Time forbids us to read this in all its detail, but again, we have a covenant established here. And here in Genesis chapter 9, we have God giving another covenant to Noah, which is really a reaffirmation of what came in chapter 6 that we just read there. But in chapter 9, the same basic idea is restated. Here is a covenant, and this covenant gets a bit more specific. God says, I will not destroy the earth with the flood again. He makes that promise. He establishes that covenant not only with Noah, but even with creation itself, and the sign of it is something familiar to us, that being the rainbow. The rainbow in the cloud is that sign for all generations that God's promise still stands, that he will no longer flood the earth, that disaster will not come in that form again. Now, it'll come in another form later down the road through fire, but that's a completely different conversation for another time. But the idea of a covenant here is what we really want to focus on in this particular conversation at this moment. Understanding how important these covenants are, understanding what this tells us about the character of God, the fact that although that relationship in Genesis 3 was broken between God and humanity, he will establish these covenants to bring that relationship back into play. This is how he's going to bring back that connection between himself and his creation. That is how he's going to be able to endure this with us and to make those promises to us, to give us those commandments, so that way we can please him and that way we can be in that right relationship with him. There'll be more to come, of course, on the conversation about covenants, but suffice for now, I think that helps us understand a bit more about why that's important. But so we have seen up to this point that the introduction of sin into the world was a curse to humanity. It was a curse to creation itself. And yet God, through his graciousness, is able to overcome even that. Through all the difficulties that come along with sin, through all the curses that accompany it, God is able, through his graciousness, through his great love for humanity, the ones that he created, he is able to overcome that through what he provides to us. It's not cheap grace. It's not automatic. There are certain things that must be done to receive it. We see that clearly with the idea of a covenant. But nevertheless, we see just how great God is, that how horrible sin is. It highlights to us how great God is and that he is able to provide us that way of escape. He's able to help us to survive and weather it, and how grateful we are for that reality. And the fact that we are still here after all these years, how it did not end at the flood, but instead God's graciousness was able to win the day. There will be more to come on these discussions and these topics a little bit later, but we're going to continue our journey through Genesis and summarize the character of Abraham in our next discussion. I know this one went a little bit long, so we'll try to shorten it for next time, but I hope for right now this has been enlightening to you. It's helped you to understand more about why sin is so horrible and what it has done to the world, but also seeing how God's graciousness is able to shine even amid these difficult circumstances. As always, I thank you for your time, and we'll talk again next week.